A single father stepped through the doors of the university dining hall, then froze mid-stride. What he heard was not his son's laughter. It was the cold voice of the cafeteria manager ripping a tray from the young man's hands and announcing for the whole room to hear. "This section isn't for broke students like you. Move to the other side." In front of hundreds of students, the father walked forward, calm, only to be accused of causing a disturbance, dragged out by security, and humiliated in public. No one knew this ordinary man could change the fate of an entire university with a single phone call. So who was he really? Elijah Coleman had learned a long time ago that the loudest men in a room were rarely the ones who mattered. He was 43 years old, a black man, though the quiet steadiness in the way he carried himself made him seem older, and he had built a biotechnology company from a single leased laboratory into one of the largest research firms in the state. Wealth had come slowly then, all at once, but it had never changed the way he dressed or the way he spoke to a stranger. He wore plain jackets, drove himself, and preferred the corner of a room to the center of it. To most people who passed him on the street, he was simply another tired man with a coffee in his hand. His son, Julian, was 18 and beginning his first year at Fairmont University, and he was in almost every way his father's reflection. He was intelligent in the quiet manner of someone who listened more than he spoke, gentle with people who had done nothing to earn his kindness yet, and stubborn about one thing above all others. He wanted no part of his father's name. He wore second-hand sweaters and scuffed sneakers, ate in the common dining hall, and told no one who his father was because he wanted whatever he earned at Fairmont to belong to him and to no one else. Elijah understood that better than Julian realized. He had spent years insisting the young man stand on his own, and he was proud of the person who now refused to lean on anything at all. What Elijah knew and Julian did not fully grasp was how close their lives had already come to the university's inner workings. For the better part of a year, Elijah had been one of Fairmont's largest private donors and a strategic partner to its research division, quietly funding 2 of its laboratories through a foundation that carried a different name than his own. He preferred it that way, and he had built the arrangement so deliberately that even the people who benefited from it did not know his face. He had never once walked the campus as a benefactor, never attended a ribbon cutting, never let his name be printed beside a check. His attorneys and his foundation director handled every meeting, and the university's leadership dealt with representatives rather than the man himself. To the students eating lunch on any given afternoon, Elijah Coleman did not exist. He was a signature on documents that arrived and left through a president's office, nothing more, and that anonymity had always suited him fine. He was, in fact, preparing to sign again a new grant, larger than any before. It sat drafted and nearly finalized in a folder on his desk, waiting only for his final review. It would fund an entire wing of the biology department and dozens of scholarships alongside it. He had told no one at the university that he intended to visit that week, and he had told his son nothing at all because on this particular afternoon he had decided for once to do something ordinary. He was going to surprise Julian at lunch. It was a small thing, the kind of thing other fathers did without a second thought. Elijah had missed too many of them over the years, buried under contracts and board meetings, and something about the quiet stretch of that afternoon had made him want to simply sit across a cafeteria table from his son and hear how his first weeks were going. He parked at the far edge of the lot, walked in through a side entrance without announcing himself, and followed the noise of clattering trays and overlapping voices toward the dining hall. He was still a few steps from the doors when he heard it. Not laughter, not the easy hum of students between classes, but a sharp, cutting voice rising above the rest and beneath it. A silence that spread through the room like a stain. Elijah slowed, then stopped, one hand still on the edge of the door, and looked inside at the thing he had walked into without meaning to. At the center of it stood a woman in a manager's uniform, her badge reading Carol Whitfield, and in front of her stood Julian, both hands still half raised where his tray had been a moment before. Carol held that tray, now having pulled it clean out of his grip, and she was tilting it slightly as though the food on it were something she had personally caught him stealing. Her expression was not anger so much as contempt, the settled, comfortable contempt of someone who had done this before and expected no consequence. "This section isn't for broke students like you," she said loud enough that the tables nearest her had gone completely still. "You want to eat? You go over there to the assistance line where people like you belong." "Not here." Julian did not argue. That was the part that reached into Elijah's chest and closed around something. His son simply lowered his hands and looked at the floor, his jaw tight, absorbing the words the way a person absorbs a thing they have already been made to absorb before. He was not shocked. He was enduring. And around him, at a dozen tables, hundreds of students watched and said nothing at all. Some looking away, some lifting their phones. None of them willing to be the one who spoke. It is worth pausing on that room for a moment because the cruelty in it was never only Carol's. Cruelty of this kind is a thing with three parts. There is the person who does it, and there is the person it is done to, and there is the crowd that decides in a half-second that it is not their business. Carol supplied the voice. The students supplied the permission. And an institution that had never once thought to look at what happened between a tray and a counter supplied the room. Take away any one of those three and the moment collapses. That is why it had survived for 11 years. Nobody had ever taken one away. Carol mistook Julian's silence for agreement and pressed harder. She set the tray down on the counter behind her, out of his reach, and gestured toward the far side of the hall where a shorter line served students on meal assistance. Her voice carried the practiced ease of someone who believed the room was hers to police. She said something about how she could always tell how the sweaters and the shoes gave it away, how the dining hall had standards even if the admissions office apparently did not. A few students laughed, thin and uncomfortable, and that sound was worse than the silence. Julian's ears went red. He opened his mouth once, then closed it because he had clearly decided that anything he said would only make the woman louder, and he was trying in the only way he knew how to make himself small enough that the moment would end. Elijah did not remember deciding to move. He was simply across the room, standing beside his son, close enough that Carol's attention swung from Julian to him with an irritated flick. Up close, Elijah looked exactly like what he had always looked like, an unremarkable man in an unremarkable jacket, and Carol's eyes moved over him and reached the same conclusion she had reached about his son. She filed him instantly into the same category and squared her shoulders as though a second problem had arrived to be handled. "I'd like you to apologize to him," Elijah said. His voice was low and level without heat, the voice of a man asking for something reasonable. "And I'd like you to check whatever it is you think you know before you say it out loud. To a student in front of a room. You've made a mistake here. It isn't too late to fix it." For a moment, something in the evenness of his tone seemed to reach her. A flicker of hesitation. The instinct that tells a person they may have misjudged the ground under their feet. But it passed. Carol had spent years never being questioned in this room, and a calm man in worn clothes was not in her mind a reason to start. Her face hardened into something uglier than before, and she laughed once short and disbelieving. "Let me guess," she said loud, again playing now to the tables around her. "You're the father. Of course you are. The two of you come in here dressed like that and expect a free meal, and now you want an apology on top of it." She looked him up and down, deliberate and cruel. "This is a dining hall, not a shelter. I don't know what you people thought this was, but you don't get to walk in here and make demands." The word landed exactly as she meant it to. A ripple moved through the nearest students and more phones came up. Elijah felt Julian shift beside him, felt his son's hand close briefly on his sleeve, a small, pleading pressure that said, "Please don't let it go. It isn't worth it." He glanced at his son and understood in that touch that this was not the first time. That Julian had learned to fold himself down and wait these things out because he had already learned it here more than once. In this exact room, that understanding changed something in Elijah, though nothing in his face moved to show it. He was no longer a father asking for an apology. He was a man doing arithmetic about how a place he had funded quietly and generously had been treating his son in his absence, and how many other students had stood where Julian was standing now, with no one at all beside them. "You're going to want to be certain," Elijah said quietly. "Before you say another word." Carol took it as a threat and reached for the phone clipped to her belt. She did not call to verify anything. She called security, and while it rang, she kept talking, narrating a version of events for the room in which she was the calm professional, and the two of them were unstable men who had come in off the street to cause trouble. By the time two uniformed officers pushed through the crowd, the story was already set, and Carol pointed at Elijah and Julian with the certainty of someone who had never once been contradicted here. "These two are harassing my staff and refusing to leave," she told the officers. "He grabbed at me." She had not been grabbed. "I want them out." The nearer officer, a broad man with a bored, settled face, did not ask questions. He looked at the worn jackets and the scuffed shoes and the manager in her uniform and made the same instant calculation everyone in the room had made. And he stepped toward Elijah with a hand already lifting toward his arm. The students at the front tables leaned in. Somewhere near the back, a phone was being held perfectly steady, and Elijah Coleman stood there with his son's hand still on his sleeve and understood that he had reached a choice. He could take Julian quietly by the shoulder and walk them both out that door, absorb the humiliation the way his son had learned to absorb it, and deal with all of this later through offices and phone calls where no one would ever have to see his face. It would be the easy thing. It would spare Julian the spectacle. He knew exactly what his son was silently begging him to do. Or he could stay. He could stand in the middle of a room that had already decided who he was and refused to be moved by it, and in doing so he would draw his son into a scene neither of them had asked for, and there would be no more hiding, no more anonymity for either of them. The officer's hand closed on his arm. Julian whispered, "Dad, please, let's just go." And there was something in his voice that was not fear of Carol, but fear of what it would cost him to be seen. To have the careful private life he had built at Fairmont cracked open in front of everyone he was trying to impress on his own terms. Elijah looked at his son for a long moment, and he made his decision. He did not pull his arm free, and he did not raise his voice, because he had learned a long time ago that the loudest men in a room were rarely the ones who mattered. He let the officer hold his arm, and he turned his head unhurried and looked once more at Carol Whitfield, who was watching with her arms folded and her chin lifted, certain she had won. "All right," Elijah said to the officer, to the room, to no one. "Take us outside." Then it was not surrender. Julian did not understand that yet, and neither did anyone else. But there was something in the calm of it. Something in the way the man let himself be led toward the doors without a single word of protest that made the officer's grip loosened slightly and made a few of the watching students lower their phones and glance at one another, uncertain now, as though they had all just witnessed the beginning of something rather than the end of it. Elijah walked toward the doors of the dining hall with his son beside him and the whole room watching his back. And he did not look small. He looked, if anything, like a man who had just decided precisely what he was going to do and who had all the time in the world to do it. Behind him, Carol Whitfield was already turning back to her counter, brushing the moment off her hands, telling the students nearest her to go on to finish their lunch, that it was handled. She had done this many times. She had never once been wrong about who she could treat this way, and she saw no reason to believe she was wrong now. She had no idea that the quiet man she had just ordered out of her dining hall had sitting on a desk across town a folder holding the single largest grant the university had ever been offered, and that his signature was the only thing standing between Fairmont and a great deal of money it had already begun to spend in its plans. She had no idea who had just walked out her doors, and perhaps that is worth carrying out of that room with them. A man in a worn jacket held a door open for the truth and let it walk out ahead of him. When you meet a stranger, you are not seeing a person. You are seeing the 10 seconds of them that happen to be facing you. Everything else, everything that matters is standing quietly behind that, waiting to see whether you will bother to ask. Outside in the cool air of the courtyard, Julian pulled his arm loose from the officer's slackening grip and turned on his father. His voice, low and shaking, caught somewhere between anger and something that looked a great deal like shame. "Why did you do that?" he said. "Why couldn't you just let it go? Now everyone saw. Now they all." He stopped pressing the heel of his hand against his eyes. Elijah watched him, and the hard thing that had settled in his chest inside the dining hall did not soften, but the way he looked at his son did. "I know you wanted to handle it yourself," he said quietly. "I know you didn't want me here at all today, and I know why, and I'm not going to pretend I understand everything that's been happening to you in that room." He did not dial security supervisor, and he did not call his attorney. He scrolled to a number that only a handful of people in the state had a private line that rang directly to the office of the president of Fairmont University, and he lifted the phone to his ear while his son watched, not yet understanding, and pressed call. Elijah did not get to finish the call outside. Before the line connected, one of the security officers, the broad one who had first reached for his arms, stepped between him and the doors as though a man on a phone were a new kind of threat. The officer had gone back inside, briefly spoken with Carol, and returned carrying her certainty like a borrowed coat. Whatever she had told him in those 30 seconds had hardened him, and now he wanted the two of them off the property entirely, not standing in the courtyard making calls. "Sir, you're going to have to leave the campus," the officer said, one hand raised. "The manager says you were aggressive with her staff. I'm not going to ask again." He gestured back toward the dining hall toward Carol, who had come to stand just inside the glass doors with her arms crossed, watching the men she had summoned do exactly what she wanted. She had chosen to believe her own version so completely that she now stood as a witness to it. Elijah lowered the phone without ending the call, letting it stay live against his chest, and looked at the officer with the same unhurried patience he had shown inside. "I'm not being aggressive," he said. "I'm standing in a courtyard talking to my son, but I understand you've been told a story and I understand you believe it. That's going to be cleared up in a few minutes. And when it is, I'd like you to remember that I asked you calmly and you chose her word over mine because of what I'm wearing." The officer didn't like that, but he didn't move to grab him again either. Something in the steadiness of the man had begun to work on him the way it had worked on the students. A small crack in the certainty of suspicion that the arithmetic he had done at first glance might not add up. He held his position because he had committed to it, but he stopped advancing, and that was enough. Through the glass, Carol's voice carried out to them thin and triumphant as she turned to address the students who had drifted toward the doors to watch. She was not content to have won. She wanted the room to agree that she had won. "You see how they are," she told them loud enough for the courtyard to hear. "They come in here, they cause a scene, and then they act like they're the victims. This is exactly why we have rules about who belongs where. People like that don't understand the word no." Julian flinched at the words in a way that told Elijah more than any explanation could have. He had lowered himself onto the edge of a concrete planter, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. And when Carol's voice reached him, he closed his eyes as though the sound itself had a physical weight. It was the posture of someone who had heard variations of this many times and had built no defense against it except stillness. "This isn't the first time," Elijah said quietly, sitting down beside his son on the cold edge of the planter. It was not a question. "Tell me." Julian was quiet for a long moment, turning something over. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and flat, drained of the anger he'd shown a few minutes before, left with only the tiredness underneath it. "The second week," he said, "I sat in the main section because I didn't know it was like a thing. She came over and told me to move. Said the food on that side was for people who could actually pay for it." He turned his hands over, looking at his palms. I checked. It's the same food, same line, same everything. She just decided one side was for people she liked the look of. He went on, the words coming easier now that they had started. He told his father how it had happened 3 or 4 times since. Always the same. Always when the room was full enough for an audience, how she never touched the students who came in with nice watches and clean sneakers. How she seemed to have a sense for the ones who wouldn't fight back the scholarship students, and the ones working 2 jobs, the ones who couldn't afford to make trouble. How he had never reported it, because reporting it meant explaining who he was, or worse, being a person who complained, and he had wanted so badly to just be a student who belonged there on his own. "So I moved," Julian said. "Every time I just moved." He looked at his father for the first time, and there was something raw in it. "And today, you didn't. And I was so angry at you because now everyone knows I'm the one who couldn't handle it himself. But I keep thinking he stopped his jaw working. I keep thinking about how it felt every other time when nobody stood up, and how it felt today when somebody did. And I hate that those 2 things feel so different." Elijah didn't reach for a lesson or a reassurance. He simply sat with it, letting his son's words land fully, because he understood that what Julian needed was not to be told he'd done nothing wrong. He'd done nothing wrong. What he needed was for the wrongness of the thing to finally be named by someone other than himself. And if I am honest, this is the part of the whole story I find myself returning to. Not the phone call, not the president running across a courtyard. Just a boy on a cold, concrete planter saying, "Every time I just moved." I think most of us have moved. I think most of us have made ourselves a little smaller to keep an afternoon from getting complicated, and told ourselves afterward that it was maturity. It usually isn't. It is usually just loneliness that has learned good manners. And the reason that boy's voice shakes is not because he was hurt. It is because for the first time, somebody sat down next to him and did not tell him it was nothing. Inside the dining hall, the mood had begun to shift in a way Carol did not notice because she was still performing for a crowd she assumed was on her side. But the students had phones, and the phones had been recording. And now those recordings were moving. A clip of Carol pulling the tray from Julian's hands, of her voice saying, "Broke students like you." Of 2 officers steering a calm man toward the doors was already spreading from one thread to another across the campus network. It moved faster than any official account could have because it needed no explanation. People watched 10 seconds of it and understood exactly what they were seeing. The first sign that the ground had moved came when a student pushed out through the doors into the courtyard. A young woman with a worn backpack, and walked straight up to Elijah and Julian with the nervous determination of someone doing a thing before their courage ran out. "I saw what she did," she said. "I've seen her do it to other people too. My roommate got moved out of that section twice." She looked at Julian. "You didn't do anything. I just wanted to say that where somebody could hear it. She was the first, and she was not the last." Behind her, another student came out, and then 2 more, drawn by the clip circulating on their phones and by the small crowd forming around the planter. They didn't shout or make speeches. They simply stood near Elijah and Julian rather than near the doors, and the geography of it began to say something. The room that had been silent a few minutes earlier was reorganizing itself slowly around the question of who had actually been wronged. It was into this shifting scene that a black sedan pulled up along the courtyard's edge with more speed than campus traffic rules allowed, and the president of Fairmont University got out of it before it had fully stopped. Gregory Sutton was a lean, silver-haired man who wore his authority the way he wore his suit, precisely and without comfort. And right now that authority was cracked straight through with alarm. He had taken Elijah's call in his office. He had recognized the private number instantly because only a handful of people had it, and he had heard perhaps 15 words before he was moving. 2 of his senior administrators hurried behind him, one still holding the door of the building open. Both of them wearing the particular expression of people who did not yet know why they were running, but understood from their president's face that they should be. Sutton crossed the courtyard, fast his eyes finding Elijah. And what happened to his face when he saw the man sitting on the edge of a concrete planter beside a security officer was something the watching students would talk about for a long time afterward. The president of the university stopped in front of the quiet man in the worn jacket, and every trace of institutional composure fell off him at once. "Mr. Coleman," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the name. "Elijah. My God, I came the second you called." "What?" His eyes went to the two officers, to Julian, to the students gathered close, assembling the picture in real time and clearly not liking any part of it. What happened here? The name did the work that no jacket ever could. The security officer who had been standing guard heard it, saw the president of the entire university say it with something close to fear in his voice, and felt the floor drop out from under everything he'd assumed for the last 10 minutes. He took a step back from Elijah almost involuntarily, his authority evaporating, his hand rising toward his own mouth through the glass doors. Carol Whitfield was watching too, and the sight of the president himself sprinting across the courtyard to speak to the man she had thrown out did not yet mean to her what it should have. She pushed the doors open, still riding the momentum of her own certainty, and called out across the courtyard in a voice pitched to explain herself first. "President Sutton, I'm glad you're here. These two were harassing my staff. I had to have them removed. I don't know what they told you, but be quiet." Sutton did not shout it. He said it the way a man says something he cannot believe he is having to say, and it stopped Carol cold in the doorway. He turned back to Elijah, and his hands lifted slightly helplessly. "Whatever this is, we will fix it. Please tell me what happened." Elijah rose from the planter without hurry, and when he spoke, his voice carried not because he raised it, but because the courtyard had gone quiet enough to hear a low voice clearly. "You know who I am, Gregory," he said. "So does your office, and so do your attorneys, and so does whoever's been spending the money I haven't signed for yet." But nobody in that dining hall knew, and that's exactly the point. I came here today to have lunch with my son. Nothing else. No meeting, no announcement, just a father in ordinary clothes walking into a room. He looked toward Carol in the doorway, and there was no anger in his face, which somehow made it worse for her than anger would have. "And in that room, your manager took the tray out of my son's hands and told him in front of hundreds of people that broke students like him didn't belong. Then she called security on me for asking her to check her facts. Then your officers walked us out because of what we were wearing." He let his gaze move across the gathered students, the ones who had come to stand beside them. "And it turns out my son isn't the only one. He's just the only one whose father happened to walk in at the wrong moment." Sutton's face had gone gray. The reality of it was arriving in layers, each worse than the last. The man being humiliated was not merely a wealthy donor. He was the single most important partner the university had, the source of a grant that existed in the school's budget projections as a done deal, a signature away from funding an entire wing and dozens of scholarships. And he had been thrown out of a dining hall for looking poor. This is Sutton started, then abandoned the sentence because there was no good end to it. He turned to his administrators, his voice going tight and fast. "I want the footage. All of it. I want statements from every student who saw this. And I want." His eyes went to Carol, and something in him hardened into decision. "Miss Whitfield, you are suspended as of this moment. Give your badge to the officer and go home. Do not go back into that dining hall." Carol's certainty finally broke, and what replaced it was not remorse, but panic dressed as outrage. "You can't do that," she said, her voice climbing. "I have run that dining hall for 11 years. I was enforcing our policies. You're going to suspend me over some." She caught herself before the word came out, but everyone heard the shape of it. The same word she'd used inside, and the flinch that went through the students told her she'd finished losing them. But the moment Sutton expected to be simple did not stay simple. And this was the point at which Elijah's presence stopped being the whole story. Because the students who had gathered were no longer only witnesses to what had happened to Julian. They had their own accounts. And now, with the president of the university standing right there and a manager being suspended in front of them, they began, one after another, to speak. The young woman with a worn backpack went first, describing what she'd seen done to her roommate. Then a young man in a dining hall apron, one of Carol's own staff, stepped forward with the particular fear of a person risking their job and said quietly that he had been told more than once to watch which students he served in which section and that he had hated it and had said nothing because he needed the paycheck. Another student described being moved, then another. The accounts came without drama, which made them harder to dismiss, and Sutton's face grew tighter with each one. What had begun as a single ugly incident was widening into something with a history, and the recording spreading across the campus network meant it would not stay contained on this courtyard. Sutton understood standing there that he was no longer managing an embarrassment. He was managing the first hour of a crisis. And the way he handled the next part would determine whether the university came out of it as a place that fixed its failures or a place that had covered for them for years. Elijah watched the president arrive at that understanding, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. The private grievance had drained out of it, replaced by something steadier and larger. "Gregory," he said, drawing the man's attention back. "I want to be clear about something because I think you're about to make a mistake about what this is." He glanced at Julian, then back. "This stopped being about my son the moment those students started talking. My name got you out of your chair in 90 seconds. Fine. But there are people on this campus who don't have a name that does that. And they've been standing where Julian stood with nobody coming. So I'm not interested in an apology that fixes my afternoon. I'm interested in what you're going to do about the fact that this room has worked this way for years and your entire staff knew." Sutton met his eyes and understood that the grant, the partnership, the entire relationship he'd been counting on now hung not on his contrition toward one man, but on whether he was willing to look honestly at something rotten in his own house. The gathered students watched him, the phone still recording, and the president of Fairmont University realized there was no version of the next few hours in which he got to be comfortable. "You're right," he said finally, quietly. And it cost him something to say it in front of everyone. "You're completely right, and I'm going to find out how deep this goes tonight, whatever it turns out to be." He looked at the students around him, at his own dining hall worker who had risked his job to speak, and the weight of what he was promising settled onto him fully. "All of you who saw something, I need you to tell someone. I'll make sure there's someone to tell." Behind the glass, Carol Whitfield stood alone. Now her badge already surrendered, watching the room she had ruled for over a decade turn its back on her one person at a time, and beginning far too late to understand what the quiet man had actually meant when he told her she'd want to be certain before she said another word. And notice what it cost, and what it did not cost, to be the first person out that door. A girl with a worn backpack simply walked to where the truth was standing and stood next to it. She did not shout. She lost nothing. And after her, it became easier for everyone. If you are ever the only one who saw, be the first to say so out loud. Courage is rarely a speech. Most days, it is just choosing where to stand. The investigation Sutton had promised in the courtyard did not wait for morning. By that same evening, a small team from the university's administration had begun pulling records, and what they found over the following days confirmed everything the students had said and more. Carol Whitfield had run the dining hall for 11 years with almost no oversight, and in that time a pattern had formed that no single complaint had ever been large enough to expose. There had been complaints, it turned out. There had simply never been anyone with the standing or the courage to make one stick. Staff members who had stayed silent for years, afraid for their jobs, now spoke to the investigators one after another. The young man in the apron who had stepped forward in the courtyard was only the first. Others described being instructed, never in writing, to steer certain students toward the assistance line, regardless of what those students could actually pay to keep the main section looking a certain way. It had never been official policy, It had been Carol's personal sense of who belonged enforced quietly for over a decade because she had correctly guessed that the people she targeted were the least able to fight back. For Sutton, each new account was worse than the last because each one made clear that this had not been a single bad afternoon. It had been a culture small and daily and corrosive, operating in a building thousands of students passed through, and his administration had never once looked closely enough to see it. The recordings from the incident had by now spread well beyond the campus, and the pressure on the university's leadership had become something they could not manage quietly. They were being asked publicly whether Fairmont was a place that let this happen. The grant made it heavier still. The single largest gift the university had ever been offered sat unsigned, and everyone in the president's office understood that Elijah Coleman had every reason to walk away from a school that had thrown his son out of a dining hall for looking poor. Losing it would not only cost the biology wing and the scholarships attached to it, it would tell every other donor exactly what kind of place Fairmont had turned out to be. Sutton found himself facing the possibility that one manager's cruelty might unravel far more than one manager's career. But the crisis, as Elijah had told him it would, had stopped being about the money. Somewhere in those few days, it had become a question the whole campus was asking out loud, which was whether the university would actually do anything or whether it would apologize to the wealthy man, quietly relocate the manager, and let everyone else go back to being invisible. The students who had spoken were watching to see if speaking had meant anything. Sutton understood that he was being measured, and that this time the measurement was public. He made his choice, and he made it where everyone could see it. Several days after the incident at midday, with the dining hall full again and word having spread that the president would be there, Gregory Sutton walked into the same room where it had happened and stood in the open center of it, and he did not hide behind a prepared statement read from a stage. He spoke plainly the way Elijah had spoken to him in the courtyard, because he had learned that much at least. He apologized first to Julian directly by name in front of the room. He said that a student had been humiliated in that dining hall for no reason other than the way he looked, that it had happened more than once to him and to others, and that the university had failed every one of them by never looking. He did not soften it with excuses about policy or understaffing. He said the failure was the institution's, and that meant it was his, and he was not going to pretend otherwise to make the moment easier for himself. Then he told the room what he was doing about it. Carol Whitfield, suspended days earlier, had after a full review been formally terminated. Her employment ended for abuse of her position, for the repeated humiliation of students, and for the damage she had done to people who had trusted that a dining hall was simply a place to eat. There would be no quiet transfer, no comfortable exit. The decision was final, and Sutton said so in front of the very students she had spent so long deciding did not belong. The response was not applause, which would have felt wrong. It was something quieter and more significant. Across the room, students who had carried their own versions of what Carol had done to them began for the first time to feel that saying it out loud might be safe. In the days that followed, more of them came forward not to pile on, but because a door had opened that had been shut for years, and people who had learned to keep their heads down discovered they were not alone and never had been. Julian sat through the apology in a seat near the middle of the room in the same plain sweater he'd worn the day it happened, and something in him shifted as he listened. He had spent that whole first day angry that his father had refused to let it go, angry that his careful private life had been cracked open in front of everyone. But watching the room, now watching students he'd never met find the nerve to speak because someone finally had, he understood something he had gotten wrong. He had believed that staying silent and stepping aside had been the mature thing, the strong thing, a way of handling it himself. And he saw now that it had not handled anything at all. His silence every time had simply told Carol she was right about who she could do this to, and had left the next student to face her alone. The thing he had mistaken for strength had been the exact thing that let it continue. That understanding did not stay an idea in his head. In the weeks that followed the apology as the university began, the harder work of actually changing, Julian became one of the students others came to. When someone was unsure whether what had happened to them was worth reporting, whether anyone would listen, he was the one who told them it was, and they would because he had learned firsthand what happened when someone finally spoke and what happened when no one did. The reserved young man who had wanted only to disappear into the crowd had found a reason to stop disappearing. The university's changes went beyond removing one person, which both Elijah and the students had insisted was not enough on its own. Sutton's administration overhauled the entire dining operation. The artificial division of the hall into sections for different kinds of students was eliminated. There was one line, one room, one standard of treatment for everyone who walked in. New rules governing how staff were to treat students were written down in plain language with a clear way to report violations that did not depend on anyone being brave enough to confront a manager alone. The conditions that had let the old cruelty operate unseen were dismantled one by one. Elijah watched all of it from a careful distance, involved but not looming, and he made his own position clear to Sutton in a private conversation that mattered more than either of them said aloud. He had not withdrawn the grant, but he had not signed it either, not yet, and he told the president plainly that his continued partnership with Fairmont was no longer a matter of budgets and buildings. He would stay. He would fund the wing and the scholarships and more, but only when the reforms the university had promised were real and finished rather than announced, and he would be watching to see which one it turned out to be. It was not a threat, and Sutton did not take it as one. It was the natural position of a man who had funded the place quietly for a year, believing it was one kind of institution, and had discovered by walking in one ordinary afternoon that it was capable of being another. He was giving the university the chance to become the thing he had thought it already was. Sutton, to his credit, understood the difference and understood that he was being trusted rather than punished, and that the trust came with the expectation that he would earn it. The reforms held over the following weeks and into the months after the changes stopped being announcements and became simply the way the dining hall worked. Students who had once braced themselves walking into that room stopped bracing. The staff who had hated their old instructions worked without them. Slowly, the way trust rebuilds, the students of Fairmont began to believe again that the place they attended was fair, that a person's clothes did not determine how they were treated inside its walls, and that when they had been told the university would do better, the words had meant something. Several months after the afternoon that had started all of it, Elijah Coleman came back to campus again at midday, again through a side entrance, again in ordinary clothes that no longer meant anything different than they ever had. This time no one stopped him, but that was not the thing he had come to see. He walked to the doors of the dining hall and looked in, and he stood there for a moment the way he had once stood there before, except that everything he heard now was different from what he had heard that first day. There was no sharp voice cutting across the room. There was no silence spreading from a manager pulling a tray out of someone's hands. There was only the ordinary noise of a full dining hall, trays and conversation, and the shuffle of a single line moving steadily along a single counter. Students of every kind standing in it together with no one deciding which of them belonged where. And in that line, unhurried, talking easily with the people around him, stood Julian. He was in the main section in the middle of the room holding his own tray. And no one looked at his plain sweater or his worn sneakers and thought anything at all about them because there was no longer any room for the thought. He was simply a student getting lunch treated with the plain, unremarkable respect that everyone in the line was getting, which was all he had ever wanted and all he had once been denied. Elijah watched his son from the doorway, and what moved him was not the sight of a room that had been reformed, though he had helped make that happen. And it was not the knowledge that his name still carried enough weight to bring a university president running across a courtyard in 90 seconds. Those things were real, but they were not what made him stay a moment longer than he needed to. What made him stay was that his son had stopped hiding. Julian was not in the middle of that room because his father was a donor or because anyone knew who he was. He was there because the room had finally been made fair enough that a person like him could stand in the center of it and be treated like anyone else, and because he had helped to make it that way by learning to speak up when it would have been easier to keep quiet. The young man who had wanted to build something of his own on his own terms had done exactly that, and it had turned out to be larger than a grade or a reputation. Elijah did not go in and interrupt it. He did not need his son to see him, and he did not need to be at the center of the thing he had set in motion, because he had never wanted the center of any room. He watched Julian reach the counter, take his food and carry his tray to a table where other students made space for him without a second thought. And then Elijah turned and walked back out into the afternoon unnoticed, which was exactly how he preferred to move through the world. He had signed the grant a few weeks earlier once the reforms had proven themselves real. The wing would be built and the scholarships would carry students who could not otherwise have come, and in time, the afternoon that had started, all of it would fade into the ordinary history of the place. But the thing Elijah carried away from the doorway that day was not about money or buildings or the quiet satisfaction of a system corrected. It was simpler than that, and it belonged to him and his son alone. He had walked into a room once and heard his son being told he did not belong. And he had made a choice in that moment to refuse it, not with volume or with the weight of his name, but by standing still and refusing to be moved. And the whole long chain of things that had followed the phone call and the investigation and the apology and the slow rebuilding of a room's fairness had all come down at last to a young man standing unafraid in the middle of a place that had once tried to push him to its edges. The lesson underneath all of it was not complicated, and Elijah had known it long before that afternoon, though he understood it more completely now for having watched it prove itself. A person should never be measured by their clothes or their appearance or the circumstances someone glimpses at a glance. Respect was not a privilege reserved for the wealthy or the important. It was something every person deserved simply for being a person. And the failure to offer it was a failure no institution could hide behind its reputation. And there was one thing more. The thing that had turned a single ugly moment into the reform of an entire dining hall and the change in dozens of lives that used it. It had taken only one person willing to stand up in front of an injustice and refuse to let it pass. One man who would not move, one student who found the courage to speak, one president willing to look honestly at his own house. From that, a whole system had begun to change, which was proof of something Elijah had always believed and Julian had finally learned. Silence in the face of unfairness only lets it continue. But a single act of courage offered without noise and without the need for credit can be enough to begin turning the whole thing around. And so a father walked out of a doorway without being seen, having asked for nothing at the end, but a fair room for his son and for everyone else's. If there is anything to take from him, it is small enough to carry. Look at people longer than a glance allows. Say the true thing while it is still inconvenient. And when the good you do finally holds on its own, be willing to walk away from it quietly and let it belong to the people who need it more than you need the credit.